Outside the city walls are pyramids. Not stone, not brick, skulls. 90,000 human skulls stacked into towers, arranged in neat geometric patterns, positioned so that every road leading to the city passes through them. Inside the city, or what used to be a city, nothing moves. Every building is burned, every inhabitant is dead or gone. And the man who ordered this is 200 miles away, in the most beautiful palace in the medieval world, listening to poetry and discussing astronomy with scholars. His name is Timur, and he's only getting started.
Last episode, we watched the Mongol Empire tear itself apart. 4 khanates at each other's throats, the Silk Road collapsing, the greatest empire in history disintegrating into chaos. And I told you the pattern of civilizational collapse would continue, but I didn't tell you what grows in the wreckage. His name was Timur. The West calls him Tamerlane, a corruption of Timur the Lame. He was born into the rubble of the Mongol collapse, and over 30 years of continuous warfare, he killed an estimated 17 million people. That's roughly 5% of the entire world's population at the time. Proportionally, that's a higher death toll than World War I, and he did it with medieval weapons, on horseback, across a territory stretching from Turkey to India. He defeated the Ottoman Empire, crushed the Golden Horde, sacked Delhi, and built the most magnificent city in the medieval world, all in one lifetime. Your history class skipped him entirely. This is his story. Timur was born around 1336 in Kesh, a town near Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. His world was the wreckage of the Chagatai Khanate, one of the 4 successor states we talked about last episode. By the time Timur was growing up, the Chagatai Khanate had shattered into a patchwork of warring tribes, petty warlords, and regional strongmen. There was no central authority, no law beyond what the strongest local leader could enforce. Constant warfare, constant raiding, constant instability. A world where strength was the only law and survival was never guaranteed. It was, in every way, the direct consequence of the Mongol civil wars. Timur's family was minor Turkic-Mongol nobility, not royalty, not khans, but not peasants either. He was a member of the Barlas tribe, which claimed distant connection to the Mongol aristocracy. But claiming connection to Genghis Khan's bloodline and actually having it were 2 very different things, and this distinction would haunt Timur's entire career. Because in the Mongol political tradition, only a direct descendant of Genghis Khan could hold the title of Khan. Timur didn't qualify. No matter how much territory he conquered, no matter how many armies he defeated, he could never be Khan. He would always need a puppet, a figurehead descended from Genghis Khan, to sit on the official throne while Timur held the real power behind it. Imagine spending your entire life conquering the world, and the one thing you can never have is the title that says it's yours. That tension between limitless power and a legitimacy he could never fully claim shaped everything Timur did. Now, about the name, Tamerlane. It comes from Timur-i-Lang, Timur the Lame. Sometime in his youth, possibly during a battle, possibly during a raid gone wrong, Timur was badly injured. His right leg and right hand were permanently damaged. He walked with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. When Soviet archaeologists opened his tomb in 1941, they confirmed the injuries. His right leg was significantly shorter than his left, and 2 fingers on his right hand were missing. In a warrior culture that valued physical perfection, this was a mark against him, and Timur spent his life proving that it didn't matter. He didn't rise to power through inheritance or birthright. He rose through the oldest and most brutal meritocracy in Central Asian politics, tribal warfare. Through his 20s and 30s, Timur fought, allied, betrayed, and clawed his way up through the chaos of the Chagatai collapse. He made alliances with rival warlords, used them to destroy their mutual enemies, and then turned on his allies the moment they were no longer useful, often with a smile and a handshake one week and a knife the next. His closest early ally was a man named Hussein. Together they fought side by side for years to dominate the region around Samarkand, pooling their forces, sharing their victories. And when they'd succeeded, when there were no more common enemies to unite against, Timur had Hussein besieged, captured, and killed. He took Hussein's wife as his own. He took everything for himself. The alliance had served its purpose. Hussein had not. By 1370, at around 34, Timur was the undisputed master of Transoxiana, the wealthy, strategically vital region between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, the ancient crossroads of the Silk Road. He made Samarkand his capital, and he immediately began doing two things simultaneously that would define his entire reign and that seem completely contradictory until you understand the man. He started building, and he started destroying. Samarkand became a project of obsessive, magnificent construction. Timur brought architects, artisans, and scholars from every corner of the known world, many of them forcibly deported from conquered cities. He built mosques, madrasas, palaces, and gardens that stand today and are recognized as some of the finest Islamic architecture ever created. The Registan, the Bibi Khanim Mosque, the Shah-e-Zinda necropolis, these are UNESCO World Heritage Sites built by a mass murderer using enslaved craftsmen taken from the cities he'd burned. And at the same time, outside the walls of this architectural paradise, Timur was launching campaigns of conquest that would eventually touch every major civilization from the Mediterranean to the Ganges.
Now, everything I've told you about Timur's rise makes him sound like a regional warlord, a local strongman who clawed his way to power in a backwater. That's what the rest of the world thought too. The Ottomans didn't worry about him. The Golden Horde dismissed him. The Delhi Sultanate had never heard of him. They were all wrong. Because what Timur was about to unleash on the world over the next 3 decades wasn't regional warfare. It was a rolling apocalypse that would touch every major civilization in Asia and the Middle East, and nobody saw it coming. Between the 1380s and 1400, Timur fought on every front simultaneously and won on all of them. He launched repeated campaigns into Persia, systematically conquering cities that had only recently begun recovering from the original Mongol invasions a century and a half earlier. These were cities that had rebuilt their walls, repopulated their markets, restarted their schools, and now faced destruction all over again from a man who claimed the legacy of the very people who had destroyed them the first time. His method was consistent, calculated, and brutally rational. Cities that surrendered immediately were usually spared the worst, taxed heavily, and had their best craftsmen, artists, and engineers shipped back to Samarkand in chains. Cities that resisted, or cities that surrendered and then revolted against his tax collectors, were annihilated. And annihilated is not a euphemism. It's not an exaggeration. It's a precise description of what happened. At Isfahan in 1387, after the city revolted against his garrison and killed several of his tax collectors, Timur ordered a general massacre. Each of his soldiers was reportedly required to present a specific quota of severed heads, 1 head per soldier at minimum, though some accounts claim higher quotas for officers. The resulting skull pyramids, and there were multiple towers, positioned deliberately at every major entrance to Isfahan so that no one could approach Isfahan without walking past them, contained an estimated 70,000 heads. Some sources claim the number was higher. At Baghdad in 1401, Yes, Baghdad again, the same city the Mongols had destroyed in 1258, Timur sacked the city a second time. Each soldier was again required to bring back heads. 90,000 skulls were stacked into over 100 towers. This was Baghdad's second apocalypse in 150 years. The city that had once been the intellectual capital of the world was destroyed again by a man who claimed the legacy of the people who destroyed it the first time. But Timur wasn't just fighting in Persia and Iraq. In 1391 and again in 1395, he launched massive campaigns against the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled Russia and the Western Steppe, the same Khanate we tracked through episodes 2, 3, and 4. Remember the Golden Horde, the Khanate that allied with the Mamluks against Hulagu, that ruled Russia for 2 centuries, that was supposed to be one of the 4 pillars of the Mongol world? Timur shattered them. He defeated Khan Tokhtamesh, a man he had once helped put on the Golden Horde's throne, another alliance that outlived its usefulness, in 2 devastating battles that effectively broke the Golden Horde as a unified political and military entity. The consequences were enormous and would reshape an entire continent. The Golden Horde's collapse accelerated the rise of the Russian principalities, particularly Moscow, which would eventually throw off Mongol rule entirely and begin building the Russian Empire. Timur didn't intend to liberate Russia. He didn't care about Russia, but that's what happened. And then he turned south. In 1398, Timur invaded India. The Delhi Sultanate, the most powerful Muslim state in South Asia, was his target. The campaign lasted only a few months and culminated in the Battle of Delhi, where Timur's cavalry overwhelmed the Sultanate's army, including its war elephants. Delhi was sacked with extraordinary thoroughness. The plunder was so vast that it reportedly took weeks to transport back to Samarkand. Thousands of prisoners were executed before the battle because Timur feared they would revolt during the fighting. The city was left in such ruin that it reportedly took over a century to fully recover. And here's where the moral complexity reaches its peak, because in between the skull pyramids and the sacked cities, Timur was doing something else. He was having conversations with the greatest scholar of the Middle Ages. In 1401, Timur met the historian Ibn Khaldun, widely considered the father of sociology and historiography, at the siege of Damascus. The 2 men spent weeks in extended conversations about history, philosophy, and the nature of civilization. Ibn Khaldun later wrote about Timur with a mixture of fascination and horror, recognizing his genius while being utterly appalled by his methods. Timur could discuss the cyclical theory of civilization with the greatest intellectual of the age on Tuesday and order the construction of a skull pyramid on Wednesday. And that wasn't hypocrisy, that was the whole man. He contained both things completely.
By 1400, Timur had conquered Persia, crushed the Golden Horde, sacked Delhi, and devastated Syria. Every major power in Asia and the Middle East had either fallen to him or was scrambling to avoid him. Every major power except one, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans under Sultan Bayezid I, nicknamed the Thunderbolt for the speed of his military campaigns, were the rising superpower of the Islamic world. They were on the verge of conquering Constantinople. They controlled the Balkans. They were building an empire that would dominate the Middle East for the next 5 centuries. And Timur decided they were next. The Battle of Ankara in July 1402 was one of the largest and most consequential battles of the medieval world. On one side, Timur, with an army estimated at over 140,000 men, cavalry from Central Asia, war elephants captured in India, siege engineers and soldiers drawn from every conquered territory in his empire. On the other, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, with perhaps 85,000 Ottoman troops, including his elite Janissary infantry, Balkan vassals, and Anatolian cavalry units. This was a clash of empires that would determine the shape of the Islamic world for the next century.
The buildup had been years in the making. Timur and Bayezid had exchanged increasingly insulting letters, each man demanding the other submit, each man questioning the other's legitimacy, each escalating the rhetoric until war was the only possible outcome. Timur mocked Bayezid's origins and questioned his right to rule. Bayezid called Timur a crippled bandit from the steppe who had no business challenging a real sultan. Neither man was capable of backing down. Neither man wanted to. The battle itself was a masterpiece of Timurid strategy and an Ottoman catastrophe. Timur had spent months maneuvering before the fight, deliberately choosing the terrain, cutting off Bayezid's water supplies, and, critically, sending agents to the Anatolian Turkic lords who fought for Bayezid, reminding them that their ethnic and tribal loyalties should lie with a fellow Turk from Central Asia, not with the Ottoman state. It worked. During the battle, several Anatolian cavalry units switched sides, defecting from Bayezid to Timur in the middle of the fighting. The Ottoman flanks collapsed. Bayezid's Balkan vassals broke and fled. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers at the core of the Ottoman army, fought with suicidal bravery, but they were surrounded and overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the Ottoman army was destroyed, and Bayezid himself, the Thunderbolt, the man who had terrorized the Balkans and besieged Constantinople, was captured alive. He was brought before Timur in chains. What happened next has become one of the most debated episodes in medieval history. Some sources, particularly hostile later accounts, claim Timur kept Bayezid in an iron cage, parading him as a trophy. Most modern historians consider the cage story to be propaganda, likely invented by Ottoman sources trying to dramatize their sultan's humiliation. What is certain is that Bayezid was held prisoner and died in captivity within a year, possibly by suicide. The psychological devastation of being captured alive by his rival apparently destroyed him. The consequences of Ankara cascaded across 3 continents. The Ottoman Empire plunged into a civil war, the Ottoman interregnum, as Bayezid's sons fought each other for the throne. For over a decade, the Ottomans were paralyzed by internal conflict. Constantinople, which Bayezid had been on the verge of capturing, got a 50-year reprieve. Think about that. If Timur hadn't defeated Bayezid at Ankara, Constantinople might have fallen to the Ottomans in the early 1400s instead of 1453. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, would have ended half a century earlier. The timeline of European history would have shifted. One battle in central Turkey in 1402 sent shockwaves that altered the fate of empires on 3 continents. And Timur wasn't done. After Ankara, he marched back through Syria and into Anatolia, extracting tribute and submission from everyone in his path. He returned to Samarkand laden with plunder, craftsmen, and prisoners. And then, in 1404, at the age of 68, having conquered more territory than any individual since Genghis Khan himself, Timur began planning his most ambitious campaign yet. He would invade China. The Ming dynasty, which had overthrown the Mongol Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan had founded, was his final target. In early February 1405, Timur assembled an army of over 200,000 men, the largest force he had ever gathered, and marched east towards China. And then, on February 18, 1405, in the city of Otrar in modern-day Kazakhstan, Timur died. The cause was likely pneumonia, aggravated by decades of campaigning and his old injuries. He was 68 years old. The invasion of China never happened, and the empire he had built through 30 years of continuous war began to fracture almost immediately.
Timur's empire didn't survive him. Within a generation, his descendants were fighting each other for the pieces, the exact same pattern that had destroyed the Mongol Empire he'd tried to resurrect. The Timurid successor states gradually shrank and fragmented, but the echoes of Timur's campaigns reshaped the world in ways that are still visible today.
Start with the Ottomans. The defeat at Ankara and the decade-long civil war that followed didn't destroy the Ottoman Empire, it delayed it. The Ottomans eventually reunited, recovered, and went on to conquer Constantinople in 1453 and build an empire that lasted until 1922. But the interregnum forced a restructuring of the Ottoman state, reforms in military organization, governance, and succession that arguably made the empire stronger and more resilient. Timur hurt the Ottomans terribly, but he also inadvertently forged them into a more durable power. Then there's Russia. Timur's destruction of the Golden Horde, which we covered in Movement 2, accelerated the rise of Moscow and the eventual formation of the Russian state. The Mongol yoke over Russia was already weakening, but Timur's campaigns broke it decisively. Modern Russia's emergence as a European power has roots in a Central Asian warlord's campaign against a rival Mongol Khanate. Then there's India. Timur's descendant, his great-great-great-grandson Babur, was driven out of Central Asia by rival Timurid and Uzbek forces. With nowhere else to go, Babur invaded India in 1526 and founded the Mughal Empire, the word Mughal being a Persian corruption of Mongol. The Mughal Empire would rule most of the Indian subcontinent for 3 centuries, building the Taj Mahal, establishing Persian as the court language of India, and creating the political entity that the British would eventually colonize. The Taj Mahal, one of the most recognized buildings on Earth, was built by Timur's descendants. And finally, there's the tomb. Timur was buried in the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum in Samarkand, under a slab of dark jade. According to legend, the tomb bore an inscription warning that whoever disturbed it would unleash a devastation worse than Timur himself. On June 20th, 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened the tomb. 2 days later, on June 22nd, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Coincidence? Almost certainly, but the timing was so extraordinary that Stalin reportedly ordered Timur's remains reburied with full Islamic rites in November 1942, shortly before the Soviet victory at Stalingrad that turned the tide of the war. It's probably just a story, but it's the kind of story that Timur, a man who understood the power of fear and legend better than almost anyone who ever lived, would have loved. Here's the thing about Timur that makes him so hard to process. He wasn't a mindless barbarian. That would be easier. That would let us put him in a box and move on. He was a genius. He was a patron of art, architecture, literature, and science. He built cities that are still considered masterpieces of Islamic civilization. And he killed 17 million people. He talked philosophy with the father of sociology while his armies stacked skulls into pyramids outside the city walls. History wants us to sort people into heroes and villains. Timur refuses to fit. He's a reminder that intelligence and cruelty are not opposites, that the capacity to create beautiful things and the capacity to destroy on an unimaginable scale can live in the same person at the same time, without contradiction. And that might be the most uncomfortable lesson history has to teach. Here's my question for the comments. Is Timur a great man of history or a monster? Can he be both? Where do you draw the line between a conqueror who built a civilization and a mass murderer who happened to like architecture? I don't think there's an easy answer, and I want to hear yours. Now, we've spent 5 episodes watching empires rise, fall, and reshape the world. Baghdad, Ain Jalut, the Crusades, the Mongol Civil Wars, Timur. And a thread has been running through it all, the Silk Road, the trade network that connected East and West for over 1,000 years. We've watched it flourish under the Mongol peace, collapse during the civil wars, and get disrupted again by Timur's campaigns. What I haven't told you yet is what happened when the Silk Road finally died for good and what replaced it. Because the death of overland trade between East and West is the reason Europeans got on boats and sailed into the unknown. And that story,
The story of how the collapse of one world created the age of exploration that built the modern one is where we're headed next. Subscribe and hit the bell. This is History Rewind. I'll see you in the next one.